Italian Renaissance, Paolo Veronese. In it, the Princess Europa, young and radiant, stares skyward as she mounts a white bull. The bull is, of course, Zeus in disguise, the king of the gods, who will carry her away to a land from which she will never return. There is something hauntingly familiar in this myth, a resonance that feels all the more acute in the times we live in. Maybe it's because more than being a character or a fixed identity, more than the labels of West or East, liberal or conservative, nationalist or socialist, Europe is a journey. And suddenly that journey has become much harder. Highly distinguished guests and very dear friends, trust me, I struggle to find the right words to express my delight in hosting this European Political Community Summit here in Albania. It is truly an immense honor for all my country, for all the Albanian people, to welcome you all to this country and to this purposefully constructed house for the European political community in Tirana, where you are not surrounded by the nightmare of Europa in Renaissance paintings, nor by the emptiness of a temporary gathering space. You are surrounded by Albanians' children's imagination of Europe. This was an obvious choice for us because children's dreams are never held hostage by the myths of the past. They are instead about imagining the future. Very similar, by the way, to the dream of Europe's founding fathers. And you have landed at a particularly poignant moment in this country, where we have learned to view the past through the eyes of the future and no longer to look at the future through the eyes of the past. Your arrival follows an election campaign in which Europe featured more than ever before, not as a divisive issue, but as a joint claim to identity, not as a list of policies, but as a deep yearning for belonging, not as a set of homework assignments, but as a shared destiny. That is why it is so gratifying that the campaign centered on those keywords, Europe, identity, belonging and destiny, won over 52% of the votes. For my dear friend Keir, here it was a result very similar to the Brexit referendum, but with the roles reversed, 52% for Remain, or in our case, Unite. Where it wasn't comparable, however, is the remaining 48% of the voters. They are not Eurosceptics. No, they are just ill-informed Euro-optimists who think I should have been fired for not having succeeded in uniting Albania with the EU long ago. But this is not my point. The idea of a united Europe is paradoxically both ancient and ever new. One of its earliest champions was a Frenchman in the 18th century, the Abbé de Saint-Pierre. In the ashes of the Treaty of Utrecht, after years of war, he envisioned a union of European states, a bold, idealistic vision of perpetual peace. His project even included cooperation with Russia, as well as with the Balkan and Mediterranean states, then under Ottoman rule. So I guess that for the visionary Abbé, today's Turkey would also be an indispensable partner in a union of perpetual peace. But the project failed, of course. It was killed by light interests and petty caprices, as Voltaire would put it, and swallowed by the fear that has long held Europe hostage. Even today, the myth of Europa persists, and the resemblance to the Europe gathered here today is striking. The dream of perpetual peace has been replaced by the nightmare of perpetual war. Instead of the bells of peace, we hear the drums of war. There is a palpable sense of shortness of breath as we confront the forces threatening Europe's very foundations. External aggression, internal fragmentation, the ghosts of imperial myths, shifting geopolitical alliances, the instability of global trade, and the deep, very deep difficulty of so many to believe in a new Europe for the new times. But I believe that there is no better moment than this one to remind us that while we rightfully think about a Europe of resistance, defense, and new military capabilities, we must not forget the other Europe, the Europe of enlightenment, human reason, and the quest for perpetual peace, not just among ourselves, but even with our enemies. That Europe, which at a certain point gave birth to the most improbable political project in human history, the European Union, taught us that even former mortal enemies could come together, their wounds still fresh from the battle, and create a bond for life. They turned old rivers of blood into new avenues of peace, agreeing that conflict could only be tamed through commerce, that free trade is essential to free minds, and that security comes not from increasing threats, but from expanding rights and equal opportunities. It was that Europe that taught us that in the midst of the most horrific conflicts, we must maintain some faith in the humanity of our enemies. Otherwise, as Immanuel Kant reminds us, when hostilities degenerate into a war of extermination, all justice is destroyed and perpetual peace becomes the burial ground of humankind. The enemies of peace should not drag us into the glorification of weapons. Here in the Balkans, we have survived war, bombs, territorial conflicts, destruction and disruption. It happened in our lifetimes, not in some distant black and white documentary archive. And we have learned that peace has no competitors. Perhaps that is why hope in that other Europe is greatest here. The most Euro-optimistic among all of us gathered today in this house live not in Paris or in Berlin, but in Tirane and Podgorica, where belief in the European ideal runs deep. We have survived economic collapse. We have survived migration and displacement. We have survived fake news even before the term was coined. And we have learned that cooperation has no losers. Perhaps that's why we believe that Europe remains the most fertile ground to turn the darker currents of history into shining paths of the future. Europe for us is as much a shared spiritual space as it is a mosaic of many different regions, languages, and religions. Perhaps that's why we feel the need, not just for new policies, but for a new kind of politics, one that redefines not only who we are, but how we are together, among us, and with the world. One that sees Europe not as a fortress to defend, nor as a museum to preserve, but as a shared soul to be protected, a shared destiny to be lived, and a shared future to be built. To do that, we must not only invest in defense and resilience, but in the hearts and minds that will carry forward Europe's soul, Europe's destiny, and Europe's future. And let me ask you, my very dear friends, why not imagine an EPC of education, of science, and artificial intelligence, and transnational lines beyond weaponry, a terrain of interconnected sources of knowledge, research, and innovation, where non-EU or not yet EU territories can become new frontiers for investments, free from bureaucracy, regulations, and fiscal burdens. A revival of what followed the fall of the Berlin Wall, when Western Europe discovered its eastern half, and the investments flowed eastward, drawing the newcomers into the embrace of a free Europe and ushering the last sustained era of growth, of real growth in the old Europe, where high dividends returned from the investments in the new frontier. Let's give Europe's young people and start-uppers a better reason to stay than just talking about weapons and rearming. And let's give them a strong motivation to build and to dream on European soil, instead of looking and going far away to follow their dreams. Our struggle cannot be solely about resisting what others might do to us. It must also be about what we must do for ourselves, our children, and our Europe. It's not just about resisting destruction, this goes without saying, but it's about daring to build, to revive the wisdom of our history, and to strengthen the faith in our own human reason capabilities. When Donald Trump says that God saved him from the bullet because the Almighty had a plan for America, he tells only half of the truth. The other half is that God had a plan for Europe too. And it could not be more obvious. Europe, once again, has a God-given opportunity to reinvent itself. Let us ensure that Europa's journey, ours in this case, is not one of abduction, as in the painting of Veronese, but of return and renaissance. Return home, to a home filled with dreams of the future, free from myths of the past, by no doubt very well protected, but by no doubt resembling not the shape of weapons, but the imagination of both our children and our founding fathers, to a vision that is ours to make real. Thank you very much. And now, as a host, I am honored to pass the floor to the President of the European Council, Antonio Costa.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, dear Eddie, for your, it's true, rainy, but very warm, creative and inspirative welcome for this first EPC summit which takes place here in the Western Balkans. The title of today's meeting is very fitting, A New Europe in a New World. I believe that is the main question for the European political community today. What is Europe's role in this new world? After the end of the Second World War, we built a new global order based on the United Nations Charter, international law, and increasing trade and cooperation. That international order was not perfect, but it provided a solid framework for peace and growing prosperity, especially here in Europe. Now, that rules-based order is being undermined from many sides. Russia's aggression against Ukraine brought large-scale war back to the European continent. This war is an assault on the international community, on all the principles we hold dear, like national sovereignty, the inviolability of international borders, and territorial integrity. The situation in Gaza is a humanitarian tragedy, where international law is systematically violated, where a whole people is being subjected to crushing disproportionate military force. For decades, international trade and economic cooperation connected peoples and spread mutual prosperity. Now that interdependency is being turned into an instrument of power and pressure. Multilateralism has been the glue connecting humanity with the United Nations at its core. Peace and security, climate change, human rights, all of these global issues can only be advanced if we act collectively. And yet, multilateralism is under relentless attack. Europe has an enormous stake in all of these areas. So our continent needs to join forces. Europe must succeed in bringing a just and lasting peace to Ukraine. International law must prevail, and we know, dear Volodymyr, that your security is also our security. Europe must also invest more in its own defense, because we have learned that peace without defense is an illusion. Europe must succeed in creating the conditions for a two-state solution in the Middle East, because continued neglect will not just undermine the stability of Europe's neighbourhood, it will fatally weaken our moral authority in the world. Europe must succeed in deepening and extending its networks of global trade and prosperity. We should never give in to the temptation of protectionism, but we should always aim for mutual beneficial partnerships and avoid a zero-sum mentality. Europe must succeed in defending multilateralism by leading on the implementation of the Pact for the Future, by upholding the Paris Agreement on climate change, by protecting the oceans like a global common good, and, of course, by remaining a staunch pillar of the United Nations. And Europe will succeed. I want to tell you today that the European Union is ready to play its full part in this new Europe, in the new world, working closely with all our European partners. The EU will remain a reliable partner, a predictable partner in European integration, in economic and energy cooperation, in security and defence, in protecting our climate. So, use the energy, the motivation, the faith of these children and the energy of our friend Edi Rama to get work together as Europeans. Thank you.
And now it's my honor to pass the floor to the President of the Republic of France, Emmanuel Macron. Your Majesty.
Merci, Eddy. Merci beaucoup de nous accueillir pour ce sommet et félicitations pour le résultat électoral et en effet ce chemin européen et cette confiance dans l'avenir, dans l'Europe que tu as exprimé. Merci et je suis heureux de retrouver ici tous et toutes pour ce 6e sommet de la communauté politique européenne et le premier dans la région des Balkans. Et donc merci pour l'immense hospitalité et aussi pour avoir rappelé que derrière le rêve européen et ce qui nous unit, l'Europe n'est pas simplement une géographie, mais elle est toujours une mythologie, un récit et une traversée. Et de rappeler que cette Europe de la Renaissance, des Lumières, celle de la paix, du progrès et de la culture est celle qui nous a inspirés et qui, au fond, donne envie. Néanmoins, nous nous retrouvons dans un moment de la vie de nos nations et de cette région qui, je crois, emprunte d'une certaine gravité la rencontre d'aujourd'hui, compte tenu des enjeux qui sont les nôtres. Et en fond, en essayant de préparer cette rencontre, je frappais de voir à quel point, et de manière sans doute inédite, on a aujourd'hui sur notre Europe un défi sur toutes les sécurités. Et réunir cette Europe large, au-delà de l'Union européenne, réunir justement entre égaux tous les chefs d'État et de gouvernement et toutes les nations qui sont ici représentées, c'est essayer de donner une chance à notre grand continent de faire face aux défis qui sont les siens à travers l'unité. Et je pense que l'unité entre nous tous est indispensable aujourd'hui compte tenu des menaces et des risques de division qui pèsent sur le continent. Évidemment, la première sécurité est la sécurité géopolitique. Vous l'avez exprimé l'un et l'autre. Et les menaces de guerre, de division qui frappent l'Europe et qui parfois menacent sa propre unité. C'est d'abord évidemment la guerre d'agression russe en Ukraine. Et Volodymyr sait combien ici il a notre solidarité. Et je pense que la bataille que nous menons tous, que nous avons portée nos collectifs la semaine dernière avec Keir, Donald et Friedrich, la coalition des volontaires qui s'est constituée et unie beaucoup ici autour de cette table pour soutenir l'Ukraine est importante, d'abord pour obtenir le cessez-le-feu. Et si besoin était, je crois que les dernières heures ont montré à cet égard que la Russie n'avait pas envie de cessez-le-feu. Et que s'il n'y a pas une pression accrue des Européens et des Américains pour obtenir ce résultat, il ne sera pas spontané. Et au fond, la Russie veut reprendre des discussions qui sont connues, celles qui se sont tenues entre février et mai 2022, qui n'ont pas empêché les crimes de guerre à Butcha et ailleurs et qui n'ont donné aucun résultat. Et nous devons pousser sur ce chemin et bâtir une paix juste et durable pour l'Ukraine. C'est aussi tout le travail qui est en train d'être finalisé et j'espère qu'il sera parachevé et qui permettra un traité de paix entre l'Arménie et l'Azerbaïdjan. Et je veux dire ici vraiment à Nicole et Ilham notre plein soutien à tous pour obtenir sur ce chemin la signature de ce traité de paix. C'est d'avancer sur des questions qui restent entre Belgrade et Pristina. C'est d'apporter notre soutien à la Moldavie, victime chaque jour des ingérences russes. Et c'est rappeler l'importance d'échéances électorales en cours qui, là aussi, on le sait très bien, font l'objet de telles ingérences. Et enfin, comme vient de le dire Antonio, c'est nous coordonner pour apporter une réponse tous ensemble à la situation humanitaire inacceptable à Gaza, obtenir là aussi un cessez-le-feu immédiat, une réponse humanitaire, puis une réponse politique, qui est la seule possibilité d'avoir un chemin qui est clé pour l'unité de nos pays et les principes que nous défendons, mais qui est aussi le seul moyen, au vu du reste du monde, d'être compris sur ce que nous faisons sur l'Ukraine. Et je ne compare aucune situation, mais je veux insister pour nous tous sur cela. L'essentiel de l'humanité, la Chine, l'Inde, le continent africain, le proche Moyen-Orient, le Pacifique et l'Asie et l'Amérique latine nous regardent. Parfois, ils ne comprennent pas totalement ce qu'on fait sur l'Ukraine, soyons lucides, mais il faut l'assumer et l'expliquer. Mais elles ne nous comprennent plus du tout sur l'Ukraine quand nous restons silencieux sur Gaza. Parce qu'elles nous disent, vous êtes étranges, vous nous dites que notre vie est en jeu quand il y a la souveraineté territoriale qui est attaquée, puis vous fermez les yeux quand il y a un massacre. Et je ne compare rien, je sais les histoires, mais je veux vraiment ici nous réveiller collectivement sur la cohérence que nous devons tenir sur ces points. Au fond, nous le voyons, toutes ces situations montrent le besoin de paix, la nécessité évidemment de revenir par la diplomatie, mais c'est le chemin sur lequel nous devons trouver l'unité pour notre sécurité et sur lequel nous devons construire aussi une réponse collective et derrière, pour être crédible, là aussi, avoir une réponse commune. Une large majorité d'entre nous font partie de l'OTAN, mais nous avons aussi besoin d'avoir un pilier européen fort dans l'OTAN et d'agir en européen pour notre sécurité collective. Et les dernières semaines et les derniers mois l'ont montré. Et l'Europe large prend encore plus de force et de pertinence dans le moment que nous vivons pour justement assurer sa propre sécurité. La communauté politique européenne est aussi l'espace qui permet de bâtir la sûreté pour nos populations. Et à cet égard, la lutte contre les trafics de drogue, le narcotrafic, la lutte contre l'immigration illégale sont des sujets essentiels que nous avons commencé à évoquer tous ensemble et sur lesquels je souhaite que nous puissions ensemble commencer à structurer des coalitions d'États, d'organisations internationales, d'agences européennes spécialisées pour lutter contre les trafics, notamment portuaires et fluviaux, et bâtir des échanges de données, lutter contre le financement illicite, le blanchiment et la corruption, et renforcer les programmes de prévention. Et c'est une bataille qui est clé, qui est attendue par nos populations. Tous ces trafics sont liés entre eux et la communauté politique européenne est aussi l'espace qui permet de bâtir des coopérations très concrètes en la matière. Troisième élément, c'est la sécurité démocratique. Alain a versé la porte ô combien dans tous ses discours et à travers son organisation. Mais nous voyons à travers nos élections, la Roumanie le vit en ce moment, je l'évoquais, la Moldavie l'a vécu il y a très peu de temps, nous avons très clairement des menaces qui sapent l'intégrité de nos démocraties, qui minent leur résilience et nous subissons des manipulations lors des périodes électorales, mais des ingérences informationnelles étrangères à peu près tout le temps. Et c'est quelque chose qui sape la sécurité démocratique de notre Europe. Et donc face à cela, et à ces fameuses FIMIS, nous avons lancé à Blenheim l'initiative qui a été portée avec Maya Sandu en créant un réseau de points de contact au niveau de la CPE pour améliorer la coopération entre nous. Et il faut aller plus loin en protégeant mieux nos infrastructures critiques face aux cyberattaques, en renforçant nos cadres réglementaires sur les contenus illicites en ligne, en traquant les flux financiers qui alimentent ces actions hybrides. Mais cette sécurité démocratique est essentielle. Sinon, en particulier la Russie, continueront de déstabiliser nos opinions publiques pour bouger les lignes. La Commission européenne, je le sais, a des initiatives en cours, mais ce qui a été porté par Maya à Blenheim, je pense, est un point important sur lequel on peut accrocher tout ça. Puis le dernier point, c'est la sécurité économique. Je l'évoquais à Budapest, mais je pense qu'on n'a pas encore suffisamment pris la mesure que nous constituons un marché de 700 millions d'habitants. Et ce marché a une puissance extraordinaire. Il est beaucoup plus gros que le marché américain, il est beaucoup plus cohérent et en fait, compte tenu du niveau de vie moyen, il est plus structurant que le marché chinois. Si nous savons agir tous ensemble, c'est une énorme puissance de feu. D'abord, en renforçant les coopérations, en abattant les barrières tarifaires, en ayant de la convergence réglementaire pour faire de notre grande Europe, de notre large Europe, quelque chose de beaucoup plus uni sur le plan commercial et sur le plan de l'intégration économique. C'est tous les débats qu'on a entre l'Union européenne et Royaume-Uni et qui sont menés en ce moment, mais c'est aussi les débats qu'on avait eus et que vous aviez structurés, en particulier Alexandre et Eddy sur toute la région. Mais je souhaite qu'on puisse vraiment aller beaucoup plus loin sur cette intégration économique de la région, indépendamment des sujets d'élargissement et d'Union européenne. Et je pense que nous devons nous coordonner très fortement pour faire face à toutes les attaques extérieures ou, au fond, à tout ce qui crée de la concurrence déloyale. On est tous face aux tarifs américains, coordonnons-nous. On sera beaucoup plus fort si on se coordonne avec un marché de 700 millions d'habitants et de consommateurs. On fait tous face à la concurrence déloyale de certains produits venant d'Asie, en raison de différences de règles ou de la sursubvention de surcapacité. Coordonnons-nous, on sera beaucoup plus fort pour protéger nos marchés et ce commun. Et donc, je souhaite qu'on essaie de structurer aussi une réflexion et un travail autour de la sécurité économique à l'échelle du continent et donc autour de la communauté politique européenne. Voilà les quelques mots que je voulais dire, mais au fond, on le voit bien, notre grande Europe est à un moment de réveil géopolitique. Si justement on veut éviter le rapt et la Renaissance a continué de peindre les mythes et au fond le grand risque que Europe court, alors je ne sais pas si c'est Zeus transformé en taureau qui la ravira, ce que je sais c'est que les risques se multiplient face à nous et que la communauté politique européenne est un espace qui nous permet de structurer sur le plan géopolitique et militaire, sur le plan des sécurités et de la sûreté de nos pays, sur le plan économique et sur le plan démocratique, des réponses très concrètes par des coalitions d'action. Et donc pour ça, je pense qu'il est temps, comme ça avait été proposé par Victor et comme Eddy l'a suivi, en effet de formaliser par un secrétariat léger une équipe de coordination de soutien pour suivre les projets concrets de la CPE, qui pourrait être assurée par la troïka des présidences et le président du Conseil européen, et du coup à chaque fois de pouvoir prévoir les 2 présidences à venir, ce qui permettrait d'avoir en permanence des troïkas et un suivi des projets que nous lançons dans ce cadre. En tout cas, Eddy, merci de nous permettre de nous retrouver à Tirana et merci pour l'hospitalité et l'amour lyrique de notre Europe que tu portes.
Thank you, and now it's an honor to give the floor to a special friend of all of us and my dear friend V, the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky.
Thank you so much. Dear friend, thank you so much. Eddy, Prime Minister Ramar, thank you, and thank you, Albania, for hosting us today. Not just in a beautiful country, but in a country that believes in Europe and stands for its future. Dear friends, thank you all for your support, and I appreciate that we share the same understanding. This war Russia against Ukraine must be ended as soon as possible and in a just way. Ukraine needs peace. Peace in Europe depends on whether Ukraine will get it. All of you know that this week we had a real chance to take important steps toward ending this war, if only Putin had not been afraid to come to Turkey. I was in Ankara yesterday, and thanks for participation and hosting us, President Erdogan. And I was ready for a direct meeting with Putin, whether in Ankara or in Istanbul, and not just for a meeting, but to resolve all the important issues, to my mind. But he didn't agree to anything, Putin. And you can also see that the Russian delegation that came to Istanbul is of a very low level. None of them are people who actually make decisions in Russia. Still, I sent our team to Istanbul, led by Ukraine's Minister of Defense, at least to see if those Russians can actually decide anything. Our number one priority is a full, unconditional and honest ceasefire. This must happen immediately to stop the killing and create a solid basis for diplomacy, first of all. And if the Russian representatives in Istanbul today cannot even agree to that, to ceasefire, to this clearly necessary first step, then it will be 100% clear that Putin continues to undermine diplomacy. If that's not the case, there must be at least some result today, starting with a ceasefire. The Ukrainian delegation has a mandate to make decisions. As we saw yesterday, Russia sent almost the same people it sent in 2022. This shows that Russia has not changed its basic approach. They make many statements, many threats, but solve nothing. They are doing everything they can to turn this Istanbul meeting into a staged, empty process, just like the ones in 2022. It's not us or Western leaders who are disrupting the negotiation that the Russians have been claiming for years. It's Russians who send empty heads to the talks. And that's what destroys the meaning of diplomacy. So if it turns out that the Russian delegation really is just theatrical and can't deliver any results today, the world must respond. There needs to be a strong reaction, including sanctions against Russia's energy sector and banks. Pressure must continue to rise until real progress is made. Ukraine is ready to take all realistic steps to end this war. I call on Putin to give his delegation real authority, and we need a full stop to the killing, long enough to give diplomacy a real chance. Secondly, we must build at least a minimum level of trust in the negotiation process. This can be done by releasing prisoners of war, returning Ukrainian children taken by Russia, and releasing civilian hostages currently held by the Russian side. Third, we need to clearly define which issues must be handled at the leadership level, not below. And we all know who makes the real decisions in Russia. Fourth, together with our leaders and together with the countries who are here with us today, we have begun to create a new security architecture for Ukraine and all of Europe. I thank everyone who is on board. Now it's time to move to very practical steps. And fifth, the United States. President Trump wants to end this war. We need to keep working closely with President and stay as coordinated as possible. Long-term U.S. support is also essential. An American backstop is needed. It's important that we all work together on every level to make that happen. And of course, I will keep you informed throughout the day about what is happening in Istanbul and whether there is any chance the Russian delegation will take real steps to stop the killing and bring the war to an end. Thank you, Eddie, again for the invitation.
Thank you so much, and it's a particular honor to have here with us, and always a special guest in Albania, the President of Turkey, Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Mr. President, you have the floor.
Değerli devlet ve hükümet başkanları, kıymetli katılımcılar, sizleri şahsım ve milletim adına saygıyla selamlıyorum. Avrupa Siyasi Topluluğu 6. zirvesinde sizlerle tekrar bir arada olmaktan büyük bir memnuniyet duyuyorum. Arnavutluk Başbakanı değerli dostum Sayın Edi Rama başta olmak üzere zirvenin düzenlenmesinde emeği geçenlere teşekkür ediyorum. Kıtamızı yeniden tanımlayacak yeni bir vizyonu konuşmak için bir araya geldik. Birlik içinde, işbirliği temelinde ve ortak eylem ruhuyla hareket etmemiz her zamankinden daha fazla önem taşıyor. Uluslararası alandaki güven bunalımının aşılması için adil ve kapsayıcı bir küresel yönetişim mimarisinin tesis edilmesine ihtiyaç var. Güvenliğin bölünmezliği ve refahın daha hakkaniyetli paylaşılması ilkeleri üzerinde bina edilecek bu dönüşümü bizler Avrupa kıtası olarak öncelikle kendi evimizde başlatmalıyız. Savunma sanayi, enerji, ulaştırma koridorları ve bağlantısallık, arz ve tedarik zincirleri, dijital piyasalar ve kritik mineraller gibi muazzam işbirliği potansiyeline sahip olduğumuz birçok alan bulunuyor. Avrupa güvenliğinin geleceğini istişare ettiğimiz bu kritik dönemde Avrupa Birliği'nin kendi savunma sanayisini geliştirmesine yönelik gayretler faydalıdır. Bu çabaların NATO'nun merkezi rolünü aşındırmayacak şekilde birlik üyesi olmayan müttefikleri de kapsaması gerektiğini düşünüyoruz. REARM ve SAFE gibi girişimlerin bu anlayışla yürütülmesinin Avrupa güvenliğinin hayrına olacağına inanıyoruz. Geçmişte Avrupa'da yaşanan birçok savaş ve ihtilaf bize göstermiştir ki